The left continues to push this man-made climate change crisis onto the rest of all of us. They claim their argument is purely science-based. They say you are unable to challenge their experts, of course, and if you do, well, you're a science denier. But thankfully, there's a brave group of political and religious conservatives looking to do just that. They've joined forces to expose these frauds whose goal it is to weaken the American economy and destroy the American way of life. Yesterday, the Deposit of Faith Coalition held a press conference to discuss all of this. They even called on the 2022 Nobel Prize-winning scientist Dr. John Clauser to help debunk the left's lies. Here's what he had to say during his speech at the press conference.
As much as it may upset many people, my message is the planet is not in peril. I think this is good news. I believe there is no climate crisis. The alleged atmospheric CO2 and methane have negligible effect on the climate. The policies where government has been implementing are totally unnecessary and should be eliminated, and that trillions of dollars can be saved.
Joining us now to discuss all of this is award-winning international journalist and Liberty Sentinel founder Alex Newman. Alex also hosts a show right here on Frank Speech. He's in our Frank Speech family, so you all know him, called the Liberty Sentinel. Alex, I'm so glad to have you on my show. Thanks for joining us. I think it's a very important press conference that you all did yesterday. I love that you're coming together in this way. So can you just share with the audience some of the tactics that were discussed that conservatives can use when debunking the climate change propaganda?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Emerald. It's an honor to be here. Appreciate so much your show and all that you do. The press conference yesterday was fascinating. Obviously, Dr. Clauser talked a lot on the physical aspect, the scientific aspect. He was the Nobel Prize winner in physics last year, the Nobel Laureate. And he gave a very technical, very scientific breakdown of why the pseudoscience underpinning the man-made global warming hysteria was totally silly. I spoke right after him. I've been covering these UN climate summits. I've been going to these UN climate summits all over the world since I got out of journalism school in 2009. So I went through a series of their failed predictions, and I was not cherry picking. I looked at every falsifiable prediction that they made that I could find, and every single one I could find turned out to be wrong. So they've been wrong on everything. I showed then how instead of coming up with better science, they determined that they would just censor us, silence us, demonize us. And then I broke down the religious angle here, Emerald, which is really, really obvious when you go to these meetings. Last year, for example, I was on the Sinai Peninsula for the COP27, and they unveiled a new 10 commandments. And the organizers of this atrocity, in partnership with the United Nations, told me that this was going to usher in the third covenant and that we were going to use the third covenant to build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. They had a bunch of pagans and ancestor worshipers and spirit worshipers. Very bizarre. Some years earlier, the head of the UN Climate Summit, Cristiana Figueres, opened it up with a prayer to the Mayan goddess Ixchel. She claimed this was the moon goddess, who is the goddess of tapestries and creativity. I whipped out my laptop, looked it up. Turns out Ixchel was the goddess of cannibalism and human sacrifice as well. So I thought that was very appropriate. And then Marc Morano came in and broke down just the total fake news about this.
That's absolutely fascinating. It's very clear that this is their new religion, or the religion they want to push, right, which is effective in controlling people. I also found it interesting, which I didn't know until yesterday, that Dr. John Clauser met with President Joe Biden last year, and this is what he had to say about his meeting. Listen.
So then, as we were leaving, he said, "Well, what else of my policies do you disagree with?" And I said, "Well, the top of the list is climate change and U.S. energy policy." And he grumbled, "Sounds like right-wing science."
So that goes back to what you're saying, Alex, about labeling and censoring, calling it right-wing science.
Yep. And actually, Dr. Clauser also proudly embraced the label that the fake media has given to people who point out the flaws in this reasoning. He called himself a proud climate denier. And he had been warned that, the reason they employed that tool was to try to associate it with Holocaust denial. He said, I don't care. I deny this narrative. So it was extraordinary. And there's some more to the background here of what was going on too, Emerald, that I think is important for people to know. This press conference took place in Baltimore at the Four Seasons, right in the middle of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So obviously Pope Francis has been making a lot of noise about this climate change thing. So a lot of Catholic organizations came together and said, look, there is nothing in Catholic teaching that requires you to believe any of this global warming pseudoscience, and Catholics need to speak out about it. So the bishops heard that message loud and clear. We had a lot of media there, New York Times, Washington Post, National Review. They were all attending. So we'll see what comes out of that. I'm sure they were there to do hit pieces, at least the Times and the Post. But people need to know this. And, to have President Biden label a Nobel laureate for doing right-wing science, it shows you how just totally bankrupt this pseudoscience has become.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm glad you got a lot of media coverage, because all publicity is good publicity, and does sometimes point people in the right direction because they go and look for something they wouldn't have looked for before. Thank you, Alex Newman, for joining us, and be sure to check out his show if you haven't already. I'm sure you do, the Liberty Sentinel, right here on Frank Speech. Good to see you, Alex.
You too. Thank you, Emerald.